we can't overlook the ways in which our mind and behavior is being shaped by having, the internet in our pocket 24/7 and a way to be, reachable and accessible to anyone at all times 24/7. That really takes a toll.
Welcome to the follow-up question. I'm your host, Michael Ashford. Come with me on a journey as I explore what it means to find common ground at a time when it feels increasingly harder to do so, to listen more than we speak so that we can understand that our differences don't have to divide us. My aim with this show is to bring you perspectives and ways of looking at issues or topics that perhaps you haven't considered before, so that you can then take that new knowledge and apply it to your ability to empathize with the people around you. I'm a former journalist who believes everyone has a story to tell, and it's only when we ask questions and listen that we truly reveal what connects us as humans. Our dreams, our desires, our experiences, our ideas, and who we truly are. What is something you love to do that is all your own? Some people like to paint, some play guitar or piano, or perhaps it's exercise like a long run or an intense weightlifting session with your headphones on. I've got a few of these things, but one that I really enjoy is cooking. I love the time spent preparing and crafting a really good meal, mixing and blending all the ingredients together to create the finished product, the finished dish, and then sitting down at the table with my family and just enjoying each other's company. We put the phones away, the TV's off, it's just us. This week's guest here on the show, Rebecca Pacheco, would call this mindfulness. And we may not think of it as mindfulness, but let me explain. My practice of cooking and being immersed in the moment of it and the subsequent moments with my family offers a step back from the constant stimulation we're bombarded with these days. And instead, it centers our attention, my attention, on the experience at hand and our thoughts and our emotions. Rebecca is the author of Still Life, The Myths and Magic of Mindful Living, which is set for release the day after this episode goes live, August 3rd, 2021. Rebecca has appeared on NPR and has been featured in Forbes, The Huffington Post, Reuters, and USA Today, and frequently contributes to the Boston Globe, covering a range of mind-body topics. And as I read Rebecca's book, Still Life, I could clearly see the practicalness for all of us of being more mindful in our daily lives. And as you'll hear from Rebecca, mindfulness and meditation are not the same thing, and we're often led to believe a story about each one's benefits that isn't necessarily true or helpful. Your book succeeded in changing my mind about what meditation and mindfulness is, because I was one of those people that honestly I thought it was the absence of thoughts.
Oh, I love people like you.
So my question to kick everything off here is, why is that such a prevailing myth of being mindful and practicing meditation, is that we have to just be a blank?
Yes. It's prevailing, as you say. It's powerful. It also weaves a myth that we're inevitably doing it wrong, because if you sit to meditate for any amount of time, you immediately start planning your next meal or writing your grocery list or thinking about a conversation you had 5 years ago or 5 minutes ago, or you're relitigating an argument you had all those years ago. I mean, this is the reality. So I think it's really powerful when people learn that meditation is not underscore the cessation of thought. It is instead observing those thoughts from a more centered place. And it is true that with practice, we get some space between our thoughts, but any level of meditator is still thinking. It is impossible to not be thinking. And quite frankly, I mean, if we look at it from like a broader perspective, here you are, you're a journalist, you're trying to evoke conversations, connections, thoughtfulness in the world, we don't need fewer thinkers in the world, right?
Right.
So it's not that we're trying to eradicate thoughts, but we are trying to create a little bit of space and a little bit of awareness of our thoughts as they're happening. And so then we can have a bit more autonomy and a bit more power over what we want to bring forth, what we want to engage with, rather than constantly reacting to our thoughts. So it's having a different relationship with thoughts rather than trying to like obliterate them from existence.
In your experience, what has been, because what you just said there resonates so hard for me, that we don't give ourselves space between our thoughts and our actions. What has been, in your experience and just from your vantage point, the driver of why we feel so quick to act on every little thought that pops up into our noggin up there?
Yeah. Well, I think now we can't really have this conversation as modern meditators, as modern yogis, without taking into account the internet and the smartphone. I do think it has reshaped, and we, this is being borne out in real time, and it's also being studied in real time, but we can't overlook the ways in which our mind and behavior is being shaped by having, the internet in our pocket 24/7, and a way to be, reachable and accessible to anyone at all times 24/7. That really takes a toll. But even before the smartphone, for a very long time, we have to acknowledge that mindfulness, that meditation has been around for thousands and thousands of years. It originated, of course, in Eastern traditions, namely Buddhism. And that study, that practice was always about creating a little bit of a pause between a stimulus and your response to it. And that stimulus could be something external, like something somebody says to you, or, a physical sensation, or a driver cutting you off in traffic, or it could be internal. When you sit quietly with yourself, a lot of emotions come up, a lot of feelings come up, and that could trigger, a certain feeling. And so it's having a little bit of stillness, or rather tapping into a stillness that's already there, that you're carrying around with you all the time, every day, tapping into it, cultivating it, giving it room to grow and to expand, so that you don't get kind of hijacked around all day long by each and every thought, emotion, driver who cuts you off, weather forecast, and on and on and on.
So let's go back to that thing you love to do. Like I said earlier, for me, it's cooking. But whatever it is for you, when was the last time you did it and didn't post about it on social media? Lately, I've been diving into this weird state of being that most of us exist within, the duality where we're more reachable than we've ever been as humans, and yet we are wholly unreachable. Being reachable is a topic I have my mind set on exploring more, so let's start right now. On the topic of mindfulness, let's ask ourselves in this moment, or the next time you're doing that thing you love, or the next time you have an opinion pop into your mind, what if you kept it to yourself, just for you, and instead examined if this is where your time and attention is best spent? Rebecca writes in her book, "Our attention is not infinite, and only we can control how to spend this most precious resource." It's interesting that you used the word reachable there. We talked about that before we hit record here, but I'm struck as in hearing what you just said, in our ability to be reached, mm-hmm. and all the ways that we are connected, and people can have literally instant access into our thoughts and being reached as humans. Where do you draw the line of delineation as to who we truly are versus everyone has access to everything about us, it seems? Where does mindfulness play a role in there?
Answer to that one. I mean, I think my point is I think we're all living our way through the answer to that one in real time. I think recently, we're coming out of the pandemic. We're coming out of a very deep, profound, devastating time of really hitting pause on just about everything for a period. And I do think I'm seeing, at least within my friend group, within thought leaders that I follow within the larger conversations in mental health, in meditation, in wellness and well-being, that people are really reassessing what it means to step back from that constant stimulation of being reachable, of being accessible, of feeling the need to capture everything for our camera phones, for social media, for our friends. Like if it's not on the gram, it didn't happen. We all now like really understand and know that urge. And I think also we've hit a point, it seems to me, a bit of a tipping point where people are really questioning whether that's a good thing. And if it's not, what we can do about it. And I think, part of it will be macro. It'll be, maybe apps change and bigger behaviors change, but it's obviously, of course, micro. For me lately, it's been forgetting my phone on purpose a few more times. I went out to dinner last week with my husband. It was our first post-pandemic meal without our child. And I thought, I'm leaving my phone at home. My parents are with my kid. He has a phone if anything happens. I don't want it. So, it's small things like that. It's what you might call mindfulness in real life, which has always been a fascinating topic for me and kind of the driver behind this book.
Dive into that, Rebecca. What is mindfulness in real life? I mean, you gave the example right there of leaving the phone at home, but gosh, that I got to imagine people think that is such a practicing mindfulness in real life has got to be this huge, ethereal idea. How do we put that into practice?
Yeah. So it maybe sounds lofty. It sounds ethereal to your point, but you already know how to do it. I promise. Anyone listening has done it, knows how to do it, has a place in their life, whether they realize it or not, that brings them a state of being known as mindfulness. So I'll go back a little bit and just kind of break down the difference between meditation and mindfulness, because those two words are used interchangeably all the time. I do it too. There's no problem with that. They work well interchangeably, but they're not exactly the same thing. So meditation is a formal practice. You usually sit down, although you could lie down. You could also stand up. You could walk. But you sit, maybe you close your eyes. Probably you focus on your breath. That's the most kind of popular and accessible anchor that we have as an object of our attention. You focus on one single breath at a time. When your mind wanders away, when you have a thought, you don't despair that you've done it wrong, right? We just covered that. You come back to the breath. So that's meditation, a practice of meditation. Now, mindfulness is a state of being, and you can do anything mindfully. You can chop carrots for your soup mindfully. You can go for a nature hike mindfully. You can have a conversation mindfully. I mean, that's what you do for a living, really, is listen to people. And, all of those things really affect our well-being on a moment-to-moment basis. And they're not easy to remember. I mean, it takes effort to remember to be present, to be in the moment, but we can do that at any point during the day. We don't have to have a fancy practice. We don't have to look like monks on a mountaintop. We don't have to go anywhere special or wear anything special or light any candles or anything. We just have to shift our awareness, shift our attention. I'll tell a quick story if I might. So I had this wonderful moment, speaking of meditation and mindfulness, with a workshop I was teaching. And, in my field, it's not uncommon for a couple to maybe come to a class together, and one half of the couple is maybe dragging the other one along a little bit. And the other one comes either good-naturedly or maybe a little reservedly or whatever, but one of them wants to be there more. So I had this lovely couple come to a meditation workshop I was teaching. And at the very end, and it was clear, and they had copped to it right away. They were like, I forget the man's name, but he was the one who wanted to be there, and the wife had good-naturedly come along. But on the way out, she stopped me at the door and she said, you made me realize why I used to make jewelry.
Hmm.
And I thought, oh, she said, I got really caught up in maybe I would sell it on Etsy. My grandson thought I should sell it. And what was I making it for? And now I realized that I really just liked being there, putting the beads on the string. And that was my meditation. That was my mindfulness practice. And I was like, yeah, A++, because that's exactly it. It was such a special moment that she didn't, in fact, need to change anything. She didn't need to do anything better or different. She actually had this place in her life that had served that purpose and she'd forgotten about it. And so she hopefully was going to leave our meditation class. And I don't care if she never sat and meditated in her life, but maybe she was going to go back to making jewelry and that was going to serve that need for her. So it can be anything.
I was struck by in the book how you talked about, and I'm going to read from the book here, consider psychological studies estimate that the lifespan of any emotion is roughly 90 seconds. And then you say, what lingers much longer are the stories we tell ourselves about the experience. And in that story you just told me, it struck me that it was almost like as if she was uncomfortable with the story of saying like, hey, just making this because I enjoy it is all that I need to get out of it. So the question then, Rebecca, is like, where does that pressure come from? Like, why is it so hard to push the pressure away and sit with just the emotion that happens to be there?
Yeah. Well, I think that is the nature of modern society, is that we want to measure things. We want to quantify them. We want to make them faster, better, stronger. Some of these instincts are good and noble, right? Self-improvement, for example, is a good and noble cause. But we also need space in our lives where we're not being performative, where we're not, constantly valuing and measuring. And I think that meditation can serve that need in a very real, accessible way. I like to say it never hurts. It always helps. It costs nothing and it can change everything. And mind you, we can quibble with saying things like never and always, but more or less what I'm getting at is that it can have profound effects to have a place in your life where you can't do it wrong, where you have space to just be yourself. Reachable is our word for the day. And what about being reachable to yourself? Because I don't know about you, but I know the feeling of being reachable to just about everyone other than Rebecca. And that is a very stressful way to operate, And so I think it's taking a moment to reconnect, to reach inward, to maybe quiet down. And if meditation works, wonderful. There, in the book, there's the how-to aspect of it. But then there's also this bigger picture of, okay, what do you do when you can't meditate, right? What do you do when life gets in the way, which it has a knack for doing? Could you take a walk? Could you, make something with your hands? And so that's why I love hearing people's stories about their own mindfulness practices that they didn't even know that's what they were. And I think, for a long period, maybe early 2000s till very recently, everything had to become a side hustle.
Mm-hmm.
Like any hobby we had, suddenly it needed to become bigger and better and, available online somewhere for our friends to buy. And that's, that's exciting. I mean, I'm the product of that. I had a blog in the heyday of blogs, and that became the fodder for my first book. And so sometimes that is the path and that's what we want. But other times we just want to do something because we enjoy it, because it helps us drop into the moment, because it helps us slow down, So maybe this book will encourage that in people too. Maybe we'll all be hobbyists. Like we'll get really funny hobbies. We'll all be knitters and bird watchers and stuff.
Rebecca, what is your hobby? Where do you go to in your practice that is just for you?
I'm a terrible example because most of my hobbies are also my livelihood. Things like yoga, things like writing. I also run. I'm a very mediocre knitter, and I like it that way. Like I can absolutely cop to the fact of being, a recovering perfectionist, of learning something and wanting to do it the best. And with knitting, for whatever reason, I don't have that urge. I'm like, I am cool with hats and scarves. We're just going to knit hats and scarves for the rest of our lives. I have no desire to do a sweater. That seems way too complicated. So knitting for me is very meditative. And, I love being in nature. I live near an arboretum, which is like basically a tree museum. Mm-hmm. So there are trees from all over the world. Some of them are very, very old. I really, truly survived the pandemic by going for long walks, often listening to podcasts, just having a voice in my ears, maybe. It felt a little bit like the closest thing to socializing, to friendship, to listen to someone talk to me while I walked in the woods. I'm also a native of Cape Cod, Massachusetts. So the ocean is where I really recalibrate. Things like that.
What took you down this path of mindfulness and meditation? When did it strike you that this was such an enormously important thing, not just for you, but for all of us?
Well, it didn't strike me at first. I like to make the joke that I've been doing yoga so long that I started before yoga pants existed. We just had pants and you could wear them to yoga.
Right.
Like really, truly, I was a teenager. It was the mid 90s. Yoga studios, relegated specifically to the practice of yoga really didn't exist yet. It was kind of this underground thing that we did in community halls, church basements. One of my first and most dedicated Ashtanga yoga practices was in the basement of a hair salon. And so I started as a teenager, and I kind of got into it for the same reason that any teenager gets into anything, which is that I knew someone older and cooler who did it. And that was the surface, that was the superficial reason, maybe, right? But as I'm now 41 years old, I've been doing yoga for all these years. The yoga me can now drink legally, 24 years or whatever of yoga practice, 25, going on 25 years. So I've now been doing yoga for so long. And what I realize very acutely, and maybe even more so now that I'm a mother, is that I was a teenager who needed something to cope with being a teenager, just to cope with life. I didn't intellectually understand that at the time, but that's what kept me going, right? So I chose yoga, or I ventured into this community hall with all of these fellow yogis who were not just older than my parents, but older than my grandparents. I mean, it was a different era. Yoga was not cool. It was not flashy. It was not popular. I mean, it was certainly on the rise. And very soon thereafter, you had people like Madonna and Christy Turlington on the cover of Vogue doing yoga. And then it really exploded. Okay. But at this point, it's not there yet. And I loved it. I loved it for not being cool. I loved it for being this quiet place where I felt I could slow down and not compete. And it was just this thing that I enjoyed for a period. In college, I became more intrigued by the philosophical underpinnings. My first book is about kind of yoga philosophy, what the practice means. So I dug into that a little bit deeper. And then when I went out into my career, it was kind of this side gig that took over. And then pretty rapidly, I found myself, part of this huge movement. And now I've pivoted several times since, during, since, after. And yoga, meditation remain this common thread for me. So even though now I tend to write about a lot of different things, and I have worked in plenty of different fields, yoga and meditation are kind of still my core. I could be like teaching someone how to tie their shoes and I'm still kind of teaching yoga. Like I can't get away from it no matter how hard I try.
You use the word coping there, and it brought me back to how you write in the book that this is not a self-help practice, that this is learning to, I believe you use the phrase, befriend yourself, like be okay and comfortable with yourself. And you just even talked about just being able to deal with being a teenager. I think we all can think back to being a teenager and what that felt like. Where the pervasive mindset then that this is something, you use the example in the book of, you wouldn't go up to a friend and say, or a friend would come up to you and say, hey, I need help. And you're like, no, you gotta organize your closets and you gotta get all your stuff together before you and I can have a conversation about why you need help. You would dive in and just hold space for that friend. Why then the flip side, we don't hold space for ourselves?
Yes, it's so natural with our friends, right? Like you would never in a million years, if your friend came to you falling apart, you wouldn't say, I will be right with you when you organize your closet, you get an advanced degree and you lose 10 pounds. And then I will love you unconditionally and we'll talk about what's wrong. Like, what? It's the complete opposite of friendship. It's nothing that we would ever offer another human being that we care deeply about. And yet we kind of do that with ourselves, and people all the time are coming to meditation and yoga wanting to change or fix something. And that's okay, because certainly when things aren't working in our lives, it's very powerful and important and empowering that we seek an answer, we seek help, or we find healthy coping mechanisms, right? But meditation is here for us no matter what. It's here for you right now when your life is a hot mess. It's not just for when you are capable of sitting peacefully for 20 minutes, every morning at dawn. And I mean, we really just put such lofty expectations on ourselves and we create these mythic standards of what it means to be a modern meditator. And so I tried to break some of that down. And, the metaphor of a friend is something that has spoken to me really clearly and deeply. Like I know so intuitively how to be a good friend. And I also see how my friends treat me. I'm lucky that way. Not everyone is lucky that way. I understand. But if we don't have that external source, we can also channel inward some version of that when we need it most. So when you're sitting with yourself and maybe you can hear that tape in your mind that wants to withhold affection or wants to withhold acceptance for yourself, can you maybe channel a healthier voice, a friendlier voice, a kinder voice that accepts you right now and can say, something like, it's okay, or they're there, or we've got this. I had a student once who had a breakthrough moment and realized that when her dog gets into something that he shouldn't, she doesn't berate him. She just goes, hey, buddy, over here. When he goes the wrong way, she's just like, hey, buddy, come back here. And yet in her meditation, when her mind wandered somewhere else, she was like, why can't I do this with the self-judgment and just piling on? So it's really cultivating this attitude of awareness without all of the judgment, without all of the, inner dialogue and self-laceration.
Rebecca, what about on the flip side? I mean, what about the ego within us? How does meditation and practicing consistent mindfulness throughout our days help break down the ego that I think a lot of us struggle with?
Well, I think that is a great follow-up question, Michael, because it relates right back to what we were talking about in terms of accepting ourselves and being with ourselves through the process. There's a beautiful quote by Ram Dass that says the ego is who we think we are, and the soul is who we really, really are. And, you know, the ego is not bad. It's not a bad thing. It's just a thing. When we let it drive the car all the time, that becomes a bad thing. That becomes a potentially unsafe thing, because the ego doesn't have the tightest grip on reality. You know, the ego wants to tell a story based on past events and experiences. That story may or may not be based in reality. You know, and we are not those stories, right? Like, we are not a fixed entity, right? I talk about that in the book. Like, you're not an entity to be fixed because you're not a fixed entity. You were once 3 feet tall. You know, like, I once believed in Santa Claus. Oh, spoiler alert, if there are any children listening. But all I mean to say is that we are always in process. And so having a mindfulness practice, having a meditation practice, having any practice that just gives you a moment to be more intentional about what's happening in the moment is a way to counteract just those ego salvaging behaviors that we're engaged in all day long, you know. And you can, with some awareness, you can even have a sense of humor about it. Like, I experienced a rejection. I applied for a writing thing recently and I got rejected. And it was sort of fascinating to look at my reaction, almost like a research project. Like, how will the subject cope with this? You know, like, well, I'm going to eat this. I'm going to post this picture on Instagram to make myself feel better. Like, you can just see the ego doing its ego thing. And when you can do that, it's just so much better. I mean, it's just much more effective, and you do far less damage to everyone around you because you can see it happening. And then hopefully not berate yourself, but just, it's a little bit of that, of my student lore. Like, hey buddy, we're going the wrong way. Come back over here. Like, let's come back to center. Let's come back to the moment. Let's come back to the real story, like what's actually happening in the moment, rather than what happened previously, what happened, what we think might happen. We do a lot of futurizing. It's hard not to. We've just lived through a really hard time where the future was wildly uncertain and mostly very scary. It's really hard not to get into that story of what might be. And certainly having foresight and thinking ahead is important. But if we're only ever operating in the future, which is a guess, no one knows, or operating in the past because someone said something a certain way one time long ago, et cetera, we're never really here. And our life is just whooshing past, and we're just operating in the future and the past and never in the present. And that's the only thing that's real, is what's here and now, what's actually happening in this moment.
A phrase I've been using recently, and I can't claim it as my own. It actually comes from John Eldredge, who has been a guest on this show, but it's the triumph of the offended self, that we hold our offense as one of our most prized possessions, especially when we look backwards.
I like that.
Yeah.
I like that a lot.
How does, to the skeptic out there who's like, you know what, that thing that person did to me, like, they don't deserve me being like okay with how the present is because they screwed up the present, and now I got to think about the future because what of the, like, you just talk in these cyclones in your mind. How can mindfulness help us push away the offended self?
Well, I think in that question is the answer, because I would maybe suggest that it's not a pushing away, but a holding space for. Like, oh my gosh, that really stunk when that person said that. I would have been really offended too. Like, almost opening up the table, or like offering the chair to that offended self, and not getting into a dialogue or a fight, but just sitting without reactivity and letting that be. Do you know, like, that is really the practice. And if you meditate long enough, really, if you meditate at all, you will come in contact with that triumph of the offended self, to use that wonderful phrase. And the practice is in the non-reacting. It's not in pushing it away. It's not in figuring out who was wrong. It's not even in forgiving. It is just in the moment, holding space with a little compassion, just giving a little bit of breathing room. Now, obviously, caveat, if this is feeling traumatic for someone, if this is feeling damaging, unhealthy, you stop. You don't do this. But with smaller things, when we have that offended self, when we have that hurt person within, like letting them have a chair, letting them be part of the moment. Oh, okay, I see you. I see you. You can even give it a name. Like you could even say, hello, offended self, and then just come back to the breath. That really is the practice. There's this practice called noting. Have you ever done this?
No.
So noting is, a lot of beginner meditators love noting because it gives the mind a job. So when the mind is like dashing around all over the place and it's hard to channel, noting is a nice little job that you can give it. And the concept is that here you are, you're going to meditate, and suddenly you're flooded with different thoughts, emotions, whatever, sounds that you hear outside, the roommate clanging in the kitchen, whatever. And you think of the mind almost like a dinner party. I mean, hopefully people are now going to dinner parties again, but you know the concept, like people sort of filter in at different times. Maybe you're having a conversation, someone walks in, you look up, you nod hello. You don't, as soon as someone walks in the door, like drop your plate of cheese, abandon the conversation you're having, dash to the door, hug mind you, like maybe it's a lengthy reunion. Like there are exceptions to the rule, but more or less we let people arrive. We give them a little bit of room. We give them a little space. We let them take off their coat. We let them maybe get a drink of something. So noting is a little bit like that. You watch the thought arrive, and then you can give it a name. And you just sort of like acknowledge that it's there. Okay, sound. I just heard a sound, or birds. And then you come back to the breath. And then maybe you feel an emotion and you go, whew, anxiety, that's anxiety, and come back to the breath. So you notice where the attention goes and then you bring it back. So a lot of people really enjoy that little practice.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I got to imagine that's uncomfortable. Especially with everything that we've got going on now. I mean, you're talking social and racial justice issues that friends and families have been torn apart about. The pandemic, even in so many ways when we could have been brought together, it caused the rifts between us to widen for some reason. The list goes on and on, like policing in the United States, even the practice of mindfulness and meditation, I got to imagine can be I got to imagine somebody has cause to have it divide them. Like,
yes,
that's got to be uncomfortable.
I'm sure someone could figure out a way somehow right now. I was having a conversation with a Buddhist friend early in the pandemic, and she said, to your point, she said, it's kind of like we're all on a meditation retreat that we didn't sign up for. Because we were locked up with ourselves in a very new way without our same distractions, our schedules, our places to escape. I mean, we really, truly were locked up with ourselves and our thoughts in an uncomfortable way for many people. But I think that we don't go anywhere, we don't go forward without acknowledging what is really happening. There's a beautiful quote by Pacheco who says, I won't get it verbatim, but it's something to the effect of never underestimate the power of compassionately recognizing what is really going on. In terms of racial justice, white folks, need to acknowledge what is really going on, because Black people have been telling us for a long time. And I think that, you your perspective and your instinct to have conversation and to listen mindfully is its own kind of meditation, like to really listen what is happening in this moment. Not tell a story about how you want to see it or the old hurts that we have, or get really offended before actually hearing what the issue really is or what's actually in front of us. It all starts with what is really happening and being open and listening to who's speaking. Yeah. So I don't necessarily, so I think it can only help us, like I think that taking a breath, pausing before reacting. Maybe there's a reason that meditation has become so popular, because we sense on some level that the reactivity, the divisiveness has gotten out of hand, that instinct to tell the story before we've even heard the information has gotten way out of hand.
That's a beautiful answer, Rebecca. That was very well put. I got to ask, what do you think of these apps that help with meditation? Are they a help? Are they a hindrance? Where do you land on that?
Well, it's funny. I don't use them, but that's only because I started before they existed.
Yeah.
So because now in my life, I am meditating largely to escape my phone. So I don't. So there's one exception. I really enjoy a teacher named Tara Brock. She has a lovely podcast, and then sometimes she'll lead little guided meditations. If I'm really in an anxiety spiral, I might listen to a guided meditation with her, or maybe a piece of music, just instrumental. But by and large, I don't use apps because, as I said, I learned before they existed. So I didn't really want to revert back to that tool because they are a tool, right? Some might say crutch, but in my experience, they work and they help people and they get them started. And so I think if that is how you come to the practice, then that's a very good thing. I think we need to have mindfulness, have awareness over how we're using our phones. And, any app really is probably going to be designed to make you use it more. That's the whole idea. So it's having an awareness of ultimately, we want you to be able to do this practice without any accoutrements. But if in the beginning, that is what helps you and that's what you need, that helps you slow down, connect to the breath, unplug more or less, then I think that's a perfectly good thing to do.
Yeah, I'm reminded by what you write in the book and the point that you make that our attention is not infinite. It is a finite resource and we have to give it somewhere. And you want to be mindful of that, right?
Yeah. I mean, I just know that having the phone nearby can be problematic.
Of course. Yeah.
It has a pulse all its own, even if it's in a meditation app. I imagine I might very easily just dash on over to social media or be more inclined to check a message I think it's important for people to figure out what works for them. That's always going to be my first answer. But I think that as we get more skilled, ideally, as we get more practice, more comfortable, then hopefully we no longer need the app, right?
Rebecca, what are some traits of a mindful person that does take the time to explore and befriend themselves? How does that person show up in the world?
Oh, what a beautiful question. It's funny. I tell a little anecdote in the book about a man, and I don't remember the source of it, but a man who started meditating. He experienced some success. He was feeling really good. He was doing it regularly. And then he kind of felt like it had done its trick and he didn't really need it anymore. And so he says over breakfast, like, I think I'm going to stop meditating. And he has I think it's a daughter. And she goes, no, please don't. So the point of that being that the people around you often feel your meditation, maybe even before you do. Certainly, I don't sleep as well when I don't meditate. I can hear an edge in my voice on the days when I haven't meditated. Things might affect me in an incrementally different manner than on days when I have not meditated versus have meditated. The benefits of meditation are just vast. They really are. But they're not like ordering a pizza. Like, you can't decide, I want to be like this. I want to meditate and I want it to, make me look glowing and sleep 8 hours a night or whatever. Like, it's not like that, right? But there are a lot of ways in which, seen and unseen, in which it helps us to show up in the world. The simplest of which being that we pay attention, that we feel like a person who is paying attention. And that's the essence of everything, right? There's a lot of unrest, to your earlier point, because people have been distracted or unwilling to face reality. I mean, look at the climate crisis. Like, look at that issue. We have lost years and years and years, decades even, because we were not willing to face the music of what was really happening. You live, I think, in Colorado, and so I'm sure fires are probably top of mind for you. For us in New England, it's eroding beaches. We've had kind of these biblical thunderstorms for the past week. So I'm not telling anyone anything they don't already know, but all I mean to say is that it's very perilous to not pay attention to reality. It can be unpleasant, but it's really important to kind of pump the brakes and to have a way that we can stop and really focus on what's going on, because then and only then can we do what needs to be done to address things. So whether it's in our families with our kids over breakfast, or it's, in our neighborhoods, in our communities, in our global community, it's about paying attention to what's really happening.
I love that. You dedicate a lot of the book, as you mentioned earlier, to, some how-to of how to get this going and how to begin this type of a practice. But I'd love your encouragement, Rebecca, for the person perhaps listening or reading the book, for maybe they're overwhelmed in it. What encouragement would you give to that person that says, look, I want to start, but this feels really overwhelming for whatever reason? How would you address that?
Yeah, I would start small. If meditation feels overwhelming, if mindfulness feels overwhelming, if your own mental health or well-being feel overwhelming, start small. There is a chapter on not having time, because it's a very familiar feeling. I don't know if you noticed, but it's also the shortest chapter on purpose. I figure I have to really walk the walk. If people don't have time, this chapter should be very short. And I offer a 1-minute meditation. And it's very simple. It essentially is counting to 10 with the breath, choosing a simple one-word mantra, and just as you inhale, count 1. As you exhale, silently say that word: calm, peaceful, strong, clarity, whatever maybe you need for today. You're headed into an interview, feeling a little nervous. You're headed into a doctor's appointment or something. Just sit down 1 minute, think about what you want to bring forth. 10 breaths is about a minute, and start there. And if it works, if it feels good, then sit a little longer. You can go back to 1, count back up to 10, or you could just sit and watch the breath. So I think there's a huge power in starting really small. For many, many years, I wanted to be a daily meditator, and I kept failing. And I would say, like, every New Year's, I would be like, I'm going to meditate every day. And I would get to, January 23rd. And and then one year I finally took all the parameters off. It didn't have to be a certain length of time. Didn't have to occur in the morning necessarily. It didn't have to occur in a certain place. If I woke up and forgot to move my car for street cleaning and it was going to get towed, I would run out the door, I'd move the car, I'd repark it, and then in my new spot, virtually in my pajamas, I would just, turn off the car, lock the door, and I'd meditate in the car. And then I racked up 5 years until the birth of my daughter, meditating every day because I had started small and I'd just taken all of those lofty, kind of mythic obstacles out of my own way.
Yeah.
So that's where I would encourage people to go.
Great stuff. Rebecca, what's a question you wish you were asked more?
Oh, I have to say, I'm going to treat this like the SATs, which is like, go with your gut answer, the first thing that comes to mind, which is a question that I became kind of obsessed with while writing this book. And that is, how can we be okay when the world is not okay? I became completely focused, both personally and also collectively, because at the time I was on contract with the Boston Globe to write a series of columns that were supposed to be really the antidote to all of the breaking news. And this is even way before the pandemic, but you have a lot of tumult, you have a lot of just crises after crises, you have 2 impeachments, you have, all of this stress that people are feeling. And so I'm charged with writing and giving people a little bit of a reprieve. And meanwhile, I am feeling very stressed, okay? So I need reinforcements, and I seek out friends and experts and people I respect. I go and have a conversation with a Tibetan Buddhist monk and named Geshe Tenli, and a minister at Old South Church in downtown Boston. It's one of the oldest churches in the United States, Minister Nancy Taylor. So I have a conversation with her. I talk to my friend who was almost a rabbinical student. And I go to the Tibetan monk. I go to see him on a day when I've picked the absolute worst time possible for traffic. So I'm driving through Boston. I'm late to go see the monk. And I'm sweating. I'm very stressed. I'm very hungry. I'm like rustling in the door side compartment of my car for trail mix that maybe I left there. There's nothing good left, just the raisins, which are,
Ew.
I mean, I don't know about you, but
No.
like, no one like holds out for the raisins. So I finally arrive at this Buddhist center north of Boston, and Geshe-la's assistant lets me in, and I sit down, and I need an answer. Like, how can we be okay when the world is so not okay? And I rattle off all of these huge existential questions. Obviously, I have a lifetime of skills of meditation and yoga, but like, look, it's not working. Geshe-la, help me here. And he's like, sure, yes, we can talk about all that. But first, tea. And we have tea. And they offer me this Tibetan pancake. It's called, I think, Bali, Bhaley. It's like, it was soft and fluffy, and I was so hungry. It was so much better than like the dregs of my trail mix in my car. I slowed down. He and I have this long conversation, and then finally, and he shares with me that he's upset. He's distraught about what he's seeing in the world. This was one of the key issues that just gutted me, that I could barely function, was, children imprisoned on our borders. I was a new mother, and hearing the audio just had unraveled me. And so he confides that, like, I see him, this holy man, get a little, upset also. And he says, but human nature is not negative. Human nature is positive. And of course we know that. Of course, intellectually that was there for me somewhere, but I needed a reminder. And I hope that what people get from any practice in their lives that brings them peace is a way to reconnect with that inner knowing of their deepest, truest nature, which is good. So that's the last scene of the book, and that's the question that I was obsessed with. So if anyone wants to ask me that ever, I would talk about that moment and that perspective, because it meant a lot to me.
It's beautiful. That's a beautiful place to leave it. It was a beautiful place to leave it in the book. So, Rebecca, how can people connect with you, find the book, just learn more about everything that you've discussed here today?
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me, first of all. This was a really fun conversation. People can buy the book anywhere books are sold, wherever they like to buy their books. I am very reachable. There's our theme of the day, but I'm accessible online at OMGAL, 5 letters, OMGAL. And the website is Still Life Book, or my name, RebeccaPacheco.com.
Fantastic. I will be sure to have that linked up. Rebecca, thank you. Thank you for writing a beautiful book and for sharing your thoughts on the show today.
Thank you, Michael. I really had fun talking to you and being with you, and I appreciate it so much.
Many thanks to Rebecca Pacheco for sharing her story and wisdom on the show today. Please do me and Rebecca a huge favor and share this episode with someone you know who might find some value in listening to today's conversation. Share the episode with your network. Help me spread the good word about the importance of asking more questions to help us find common ground. And if you like the conversations with the amazing guests like Rebecca that I have on the show each week, be sure to subscribe so that you never miss an episode. If you ever want to get in touch with me, you can always email me at michael@thefollowupquestion.com or go to thefollowupquestion.com and reach out there. I'll catch you on the next episode of The Follow-Up Question. And until then, keep asking questions.